My guest this week is Thomas DiLorenzo. He is a research fellow at the Independent Institute, former professor of economics at Loyola University in Maryland, and the author of the new book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics. The book was released this past Tuesday, and I started the conversation by asking, what does it mean to be politically incorrect? What is the guide teaching people? And what is the baseline knowledge of economics?
Tom, welcome to the show.
I'm glad to be with you, Charles.
So you have a new book. Congratulations again on the release date being today.
Thank you.
And The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics. And we're going to talk about the things you write about and the problems and how we fix them. But first, I think we need to set a baseline. So in the title of the book, it says Guide to Economics. So if you're going to give people a guide, you kind of got to know what they already know and what they don't know. So what would you say, just for the average people, what do they know, not know, or think they know about economics?
Well, what a lot of average people think they know about economics is a confused definition of capitalism. They see things going on, such as the Congress voting for $250 billion subsidies for millionaire and billionaire Silicon Valley business people, and they think that's capitalism, but that's what we call crony capitalism. 100 years ago, it was called mercantilism. It's sort of the corrupt system that the American colonists revolted against in the Revolution. And so the real capitalism is simply described simply by Adam Smith, the author of the famous book, The Wealth of Nations, published way back in 1776, the year of the Declaration of Independence. And he simply said, give me that which I want, and I will give you that which you want. That's what capitalism is. And I used to tell my students, I taught economics at the university level for 41 years. And I used to tell my students in the last couple of years that the TV show Shark Tank is an excellent example of real capitalism, where men and women get an idea for a new product or a service, and they make a pitch to investors to put some money behind it. And they basically think that this will help their fellow man out or fellow woman out some way and improve their life a little bit. And in return, they'll make some money and be able to support themselves and their family. And what's wrong with that? And so there's a big confusion in my view in the minds of a lot of Americans over real capitalism versus corrupt crony capitalism.
I'm glad you went there. I spoke to Carol Roth a couple of months ago about her book, The War on Small Business. And we spent a good deal of time on me talking about the biggest failing of those of us who understand the importance of capitalism is that we've lost that communication warp. When you ask somebody and say, I hate capitalism, and you say, well, why? And they tell you why. You're like, well, I agree with you. It does suck. But what you described isn't capitalism, right? You basically say you don't like theft. You don't like someone putting a thumb on the scale. So you're right to dislike those things. But the things you dislike aren't really capitalism. So I'm glad that you started with that. One of the things I'd like to get your opinion on, though, one of the things I think people do know, they just don't know they know it, is that they understand the value of incentives. So you gave a Shark Tank example, right? So that guy with the product thinks he has a great idea. It's something people need because if no one wants it, he can't make money. And I'll make a little bit of money. The investor is also saying, I want to make money. He's the greedy capitalist, right? I just want to make money and I don't care about anything else. But he does care because he knows he can't make money if your product sucks. He can't make money if no one wants it, right? But it's the same for normal people. The average guy will say, well, they'll say they don't understand the terminology and all this political stuff. But if you ask them about incentives, like how much would you do this terrible job for? I mean, how much can we pay you to get you to do that? He's like, well, if you give me $1 million, even though I think it sucks, I might do it. And the inverse is the same. You ask the average person about working and say, you pay people $13 an hour, and then you say you pay somebody $13 an hour or even $11 to sit at home. And they'll say, well, I understand that. I can see why people would sit home. So yeah, they're making $2 less. But they'll say, yeah, but I'm making less. I don't have to pay for the subway. I don't have to, buy lunch when I'm at work. It's easier for me to just sit on my duff and do nothing, right? So they understand that kind of thing. They just can't translate it into how it affects us globally, nationally, or from a political standpoint, right?
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's exactly what I try to do in my book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics. Is written for the average person in plain language. I grew up, my father was a construction worker. I ended up going to school and earning a PhD, but I've always known how to communicate to real people, not just academics and eggheads like myself. And my publisher put a blurb on the front cover by Ben Carson, the famous neurosurgeon. It says economics is not brain surgery. That's kind of a funny thing. He ought to know, shouldn't he? Famous brain surgeon. And it's not. You're right. It's all about incentives. And like you said, in the marketplace, if you please your customers, you're going to make money. If you don't, you lose money, and that's a good incentive. But in government, it's sort of I say in the book that in government, failure is success financially, because the worse the public schools do in teaching the kids, the more money we give them. The more poverty there is, the more money we give the poverty agencies, and on down the line. You name the government program. The longer the government spends in a losing war, the more money we give to the Pentagon. So failure is success in government, and it's just the opposite. The incentive is the opposite. And what is the incentive to succeed? Government basically tells you, here you go, you want this, pay up. And if you don't, you're going to go to prison. It's called going to prison for tax evasion. And I also say in the book, the richest people in the world, like someone like Bill Gates, you can say, Bill Gates, I don't use one of your computers, I use an Apple, so go play in the traffic. And he's one of the richest people on the whole planet. But sort of the lowliest local government tax collector can ruin your life if you're a few bucks short on your property taxes. I quote an article in my book about a man in Michigan who mistakenly underpaid his property taxes for under $100. And the end of the story was the government actually confiscated his home and sold it to get the tax money. And that's rare, I know, but still it's an atrocity. And it shows you that the menial little government bureaucrat can have a much bigger effect on your life than the richest people in the world.
Right. Wow. That is a remarkable example. And people will say it's rare, but it's still bad. And other things happen that are just not as bad, but they happen more often. And back to your title. So I mentioned the guide, but the other piece that's interesting is the politically incorrect part. And I take that as, simplifying, like you had the quote from Ben Carson, as simply meaning saying things that are true that you're not supposed to say. So talk about some politically incorrect views on economics.
Political correctness infected economics long before a lot of the other areas in academia. Most people think this sort of started in the 1980s, political correctness business. But really, back in the 1930s, the economics profession sort of rewrote what they thought competition meant. And they created this bizarre theory. They called it perfect competition. It's sort of a utopian world where everybody produces the same thing. Everybody charges the same price. You always have many, many companies or business firms competing, and that's perfection. And everybody knows everything. Everybody's assumed to know everything. That consumers know what they want. The businesses know how to make their product as cheaply as possible. And then they would compare the type of analysis. They would compare with real world markets. And lo and behold, they would say, well, the market fails because it's not perfect. But of course, nothing on earth is perfect. And so there's a whole big literature that anybody who ever went to college and took a college course in economics, they spent several weeks studying what's called market failure, where they would claim the markets fail in all sorts of ways, create monopoly, the pollution problems, and they don't adequately fund programs that the government has to step in and fund, and on and on and on. And I take that all on. During my career as a free market economist working at several different universities, I was always sort of the skunk at the picnic at these universities, because I would write these things, and all my left-wing colleagues would see them and hear about them, and I could hear their teeth grinding from across the campus. But I've written a lot of that up in this book in 15 chapters, and also several chapters on why government tends to bungle everything up. And one of the blurb writers for my book is the president of the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Alabama. And he said that I de-bamboozle economics in the book.
Coming up, more with Thomas DiLorenzo, author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
We return to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer. Once again, here's Charles Love.
Are you tired of summer nights in Maine?
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Thomas DiLorenzo, research fellow at the Independent Institute and the author of the new book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics. And in the last segment, he talked about how he addresses things in a clear manner so regular people can understand it. So here I ask him to talk about socialism, compare and contrast that to capitalism, and explain what the differences are and why socialism has gained so much traction in our society.
Well, it's popular among younger people now because they're taught some sort of like a utopian dream world of socialism, and they're taught almost nothing about the real history of socialism in the world. We've got a pretty long track record of socialism as economic poison, as I call it in the book. But the young people are not taught hardly anything about that, or why there was a worldwide collapse of socialism in the late 80s and early 90s. The whole Soviet empire fell. And most recently, the most recent socialist disaster was Venezuela, where socialism basically means that government ownership and control of the means of production. And so Venezuela took over all the big industries and most of the medium-sized industries in this country about 20 years ago now. And it was once one of the most prosperous countries in Latin America. It's said to have more oil than Saudi Arabia. And so now you read stories about how there are people who used to have good-paying upper-middle-class jobs shooting zoo animals for meat and rummaging through dumpsters for food. And just a horrific story after story like that about Venezuela, that they ruined the place and within 10 years. And our young people rarely hear anything about that. Although there was a long debate over socialism in the 20th century and into this century, and capitalism won. Even the old socialist academics. There's a man named Robert Heilbronner, for example, who was a very well-known socialist economist, the late Robert Heilbronner. Back in the early 90s, he wrote an article in the New Yorker magazine. It was sort of a mea culpa. He said the big battle between socialism and capitalism is over. Capitalism has won. But there's always this a group of people who just can't stand the fact that we want to live as free human beings. They just can't stand the fact that we do not want to be ruled by them. We don't want to have our lives structured by them and live our lives the way they want us to live our lives. One of my old friends he used to study Latin. He's a Catholic and goes to Latin Mass. He calls it libido dominandi, this lust to dominate other people. And I think all the people who we call socialists are like this. They know it doesn't work, but it gives them great power. And then there's another group of people that are just power-hungry egomaniacs who know that this is a way for themselves to become wealthy and powerful people by plundering their fellow man. Socialism has always been all about plunder. In terms of Venezuela, which I just mentioned, I read in the Wall Street Journal that the 35-year-old daughter of Hugo Chavez, the former socialist dictator of Venezuela, left the country and has a net worth of $4 billion with a B. And she never started a business. It's not like she's one of the founders of Microsoft or anything like that. But her father plundered the country, and the country went down the tubes. And she left, and she's one of the richest people anyone ever will hear of now.
Well, Tom, part of the problem, though, you're being unfair because you're forgetting that the only problem with socialism is that no one's done it right yet. That's all it is, right? Yeah. So,
it was a long right. I give the reasons that have been cemented into the economics books for decades now of why socialism is impossible as an economic system. And the main reason that everybody is, we talked about incentives earlier. This is the one reason is that you don't have the right incentives under socialism. In a classroom setting, I used to tell my students, here's what we're going to do. On the first day of class, we're going to give exams, and everybody's required to take all the exams. And then at the end of the semester, I'm going to add up all the point scores. And if there's 30 students in the room, I'm going to divide by 30 and then give everybody a C, same grade. That would be socialism used in grading. And then I would ask them, well, what incentive would you have to be studying if you knew you were going to get a C in the class, whether you studied 1 hour or 100 hours? And the answer is obvious. And that's one reason. But the big reason is that in order to have an economy that works, you need decentralized information. You do your job, I do my job. I knew nothing at all about being a radio talk show host, and I've been an economics professor for years. I make money doing that, and I use the money that I make to buy groceries and a house and everything else from other people who know how to do those things. It's called the division of labor. That only works in a private property society where you can own property, and which is, after all, what is bought and sold. And you need prices that reflect the intensity of consumer demand, what consumers want, and scarcity. That's how we decide what we're going to buy at the store. It's how producers decide how to make things. In a car, to make a car, there's over 2,000 different parts to an average car. And many of the parts, you might have 10 or 15 or 20 choices among that one part to manufacture your car. How do you choose which one? Well, by price. You choose the cheapest one of similar quality. That's what you do. But in a socialist economy where government determines the price of everything arbitrarily, those prices are meaningless. They're not based on reality. They're not based on economic scarcity or intensity of demand. And so they tell you nothing. And so trying to navigate your way through a socialist economy without market prices is kind of like trying to make your way through a big city where you've never been without street signs. You have no way of, you get lost. You have nowhere to go. That's why country after country after country has destroyed its economy by adopting socialism. And our students need to be taught that.
Okay, you're starting to convince me, but I still got one more thing out there. Okay, if I start to believe that there's some problems with socialism, but then that capitalist thing, what do we do when all the rich people only care about making money and they're mean and people are poor and people are struggling? Without the government controlling things, only the rich people will have TVs and computers and cell phones and be able to fly and all that good stuff. What about the socialism helps the little guy?
What you just said is a perfect description of socialism. It's the people at the top who live a good life, and everybody else is equality and poverty. And the people who need capitalism most are the poorest people. That's, when you see some of these people on the TV show Shark Tank who come from nothing and who had a good idea, they went to school, they studied hard, they had a good idea for a business, and they make some money. You know what the most profitable product is on Shark Tank? And I saw the original show. It's this little old lady who liked to cook fried chicken. And she said, it's a big pain in the neck to scrape all that grease out of my frying pans after cooking fried chicken. And so she invented this little sponge.
Scrubby with the smiley face, right?
What's that? Yeah, the scrubby
with the smiley face?
Yeah, Scrub Daddy or something like that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I looked up on the web not too long ago, most profitable Shark Tank products. And at the time I looked it up, that was number one. Made millions and millions of dollars. And God bless that little old lady and all the money that she has made. And she puts that money in the bank, or she has an investment advisor. And that money is going to work not just for her, but it's being used that millions to finance other businesses. The people who are borrowing that money, if she has that invested in the stock market. And so that's the kind of person who needs capitalism more than anyone else, not so much the wealthy people.
Wow, that's true. And so if we know this stuff so well, even the people you talked about, the guy and his mea culpa, why are there so many people pushing?
Well, it's because the government has been in charge of the educational system for many decades now and finances so much of it. And so you wouldn't expect the government-funded educational system to be too friendly toward economic freedom, but you would expect it to be very friendly toward government planning, whether you call it socialism or anything else. That's the agenda, and so that's why people have been taking their kids out of the government schools for decades now with homeschooling to get away from that, to give them a real education. And thank goodness, because of technology like you are working with right at the moment, you can educate yourself in all sorts of topics without sitting in a boring old classroom for 8 hours a day, as far as that's concerned. And so I think that's the main reason, the government control of the educational system.
Coming up, more with Thomas DiLorenzo, author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Thomas DiLorenzo, research fellow at the Independent Institute, former professor of economics at Loyola University in Maryland, and the author of the new book, just out today, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics. And in the last segment, we talked about socialism, and he talked about this utopian view that young people have and what they're confused about. And I wanted to talk a little bit more than we had a chance to there to talk about socialism and to point out that, as he described it and gave the actual definition of socialism, is the means of production being controlled by the government. It's kind of like a way station to communism, I'd say, because, you still have some little bit of private property where communists don't want you to own anything. But I know a lot of people will say, well, that's not true. That's not what people want. Nobody wants the government to regulate it. And I think he talks about it a little bit later. So that may be true. Some do. Some are just using this, like I said, as a step to get what they want. But even those who say that we're so democratic socialists, as the people running for office say, and we don't want the government to control everything. We just want to regulate it so everybody's safe and no one's being cheated. But they regulate it to the point that it's no longer your business. They want to regulate how much you can charge, how much you can do, what energy you use, all these other types of things they want to regulate. So it's pseudo private ownership, but really it's owned by the government. So here in this segment, I asked them, why is it so bad? So what's going to happen if we don't stop people from advancing this?
So talk a bit about what the damage will do and what it has done. I mean, you write about, you talked about the 30s. So FDR had a big part in moving us towards some of this government control stuff. He didn't even get everything he wanted. Imagine if he had, right? I mean, people talk about their internment camps and things like that. They ignore the fact that what he did to prolong and both the depression, but also to hurt the economy, confiscating gold and things of the nature. And just people talk about authoritarianism today. His picture should be next to the definition. But even some of the things they're pushing today. So you write about, how bad for the economy the Green New Deal and some of these other things are. So talk a bit about the damage that the socialism will do.
Well, as far as FDR and the so-called New Deal, that's a good example of political correctness run amok that has miseducated generations of Americans. Because at the beginning of the Great Depression, the unemployment rate in America was 2.9%, but that was 1929. But by 1939, the whole New Deal had been done. Roosevelt had been in power since 33. The unemployment rate was still 17.2%. It was still almost 5 times higher than it was in normal times. So the New Deal was a bust. It didn't work. And one of the reasons was that they had this harebrained idea at the beginning that the cause of the Great Depression was low prices. Therefore, the government should force up higher prices. And they imposed price floors on everything. There was even a man in New Jersey who went to jail for offering to hem a pair of men's pants cheaper than what the government said he should be charging for that. And so that was a harebrained idea that didn't work. And that was actually all ruled unconstitutional in 1935. And they raised taxes a lot, of course, to pay for all the public works programs. But obviously it didn't succeed because you're taking billions of dollars out of the pockets of the working class in taxes to pay for these government jobs. It was robbing Peter to pay Paul. That's why the unemployment rate was still over 17% in 1939 on the eve of World War II. And the Great Depression didn't really end until after World War II ended. Another big falsehood that Americans are taught is that the war ended the Great Depression. It did not. The average American was worse off during the war because there was a massive diversion of all those resources to the military away from the consumer side of the economy. But after the war was over, there was a great demobilization of the military, and the federal budget actually went from about $97 billion to $35 billion in 3 years, 45 to 48. 2/3 reduction in absolute dollars in the federal budget. And the result of that was the biggest economic boom in American history. In 1946, the private economy, private consumption spending and investment spending by businesses increased by 30%. Private GDP, as they call it, 30% increase. It has never been anywhere near that. The historical average is between 3 and 4%, 1/10 of that. And so just the opposite happened of what most Americans are taught. They're taught that the New Deal got us out of the Great Depression. It did not. It made it worse. And they're taught that, well, since all these soldiers coming back from the war was going to create great unemployment. No, they went to work. They went to work. The New Deal was over, thank goodness for them, and they got jobs and they made a better life for themselves back at home.
Coming up, more with Thomas DiLorenzo, research fellow at the Independent Institute and author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, more of The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Thomas DiLorenzo, research fellow at the Independent Institute and author of the new book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics. And in the last segment, talking about socialism, he was mentioning how we got here because of the government education system. So here, he continues to talk about the problems that the poor education and indoctrination have caused and where we'll end up if socialism wins out the day.
Yeah, well, I think it's because of several generations now of indoctrination of college students. As I said earlier, I taught university economics for 41 years, and until about the past 7 or 8 years, all this stuff was sort of just a few kooks at the university, and then all of a sudden it's everywhere. And I think it's because this has been going on elsewhere. I kept my head down. I was in an economics department in a business school, but in the social sciences and humanities, that's where all this crazy stuff had been simmering for decades. And you've got all these people now who have jobs at these corporations who are, this is what they think. They're ignorant of economics and of most everything else. And they're basically taught platitudes, sort of left-wing platitudes and slogans, and they think they're educated. Now I would distinguish between these investors on Shark Tank. These guys and gals are entrepreneurs and investors, but it's the corporate bureaucrats that is a different class altogether. That are being the woke bureaucrats and are implementing all these things, because the people who now have their claws in the government, as you know, they're not afraid to try to ruin your life if you disagree with them. There's no more discussion and civilized discussion going on in many universities, even, let alone in corporations now. And most people are timid. They don't want to rock the boat, especially in the corporate world. And that's a defining characteristic of a corporate bureaucrat, somebody who gets along to go along and doesn't want to rock the boat. And all it takes is a few bullies to get in there with these crazy left-wing ideas, and they can have disproportionate influence.
But don't they know that they're contributing to their own demise? Whatever you think about racial tensions or whatever, when you go this far, Coca-Cola, Walmart, a lot of these other companies do it, the people that you're getting in bed with hate capitalism. They don't want you to make money. So yes, you may be nicer to women, nicer to blacks, nicer to gays. That all might be fine. But in the effort of doing, you can do that without destroying what you do. The only way you partner with these people is to destroy what you do.
Yeah. Some years ago, maybe about 25 years ago, there was a book published called The Suicidal Corporation. And the author was named Paul Weaver, and he worked for one of the big three automakers. I forget which one for a while. And then he left in public relations. Then he went out and wrote this book. And his explanation for this kind of phenomenon is that these corporations would get in bed with people who wanted more regulation of their business, and because it seemed to be sort of environmentally sensitive, something like that. And so they thought it was good PR, but they were always confident that their lobbyists could get some sort of side benefit for them, so they could have it both ways. They could say, oh, yes, we're for trans rights, we're for this, we're for doing away with merit and hiring based on skin color and all this stuff. Yeah, we're all for that. But then there'll be some kind of side deal with the government that they'll be very profitable to them. And they were very sort of arrogant about it, according to Paul Weaver, the author of this book. And I think that phenomenon is still existing out there, and it still goes a long way to explaining why they would do this, because it doesn't make sense that they would abandon hiring by merit. Anybody knows that that's a recipe for suicide in business, eventually.
Right. And then quickly talk about the Green New Deal. You talk about that. So what is bad about that? This new, what's wrong with reducing inflation and all these wonderful acts? Why is that going to be harmful? Yeah. They have great names, Tom.
Yeah. Well, the Green New Deal, the author of the Green New Deal is the former chief of staff of this congresswoman who calls herself AOC. I understand she was known as Sandy Cortez back at home in Westchester County, New York. He decided to become a politician and changed her name to something else. And he said, and you can look, anybody can look this up online. He said that the Green New Deal is not really about the environment. It's about destroying capitalism and replacing it with some kind of socialism and government planning. That's what it's about. And if you go online and read some of the details of the so-called Green New Deal, it's very comprehensive. They want to knock down entire buildings and cities and rebuild them with energy efficient windows and things like that, and pretty much micromanage all aspects of the economy in the name of the environment. Now, this man I mentioned earlier, Robert Heilbronner, he was kind of a big shot in the left wing of the economics profession. And in this article from the New Yorker magazine that I called a mea culpa, he said, yes, socialism has, the battle between capitalism and socialism is over, capitalism has won. At the end of it, he says, but there's hope, to his fellow socialists. He says, we can resuscitate socialism in the name of saving the planet. And so that's what we should do. We should maybe give up on the goal of actually owning the corporations, but we can regulate them so much that we will have de facto socialism through regulation. I think Larry Kudlow, the guy on Fox Business Network, calls it regulatory fascism.
Coming up, my final segment with Thomas DiLorenzo, research fellow at the Independent Institute and author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back. I've reached my final segment with Thomas DiLorenzo, author of the new book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics. And in this segment, I asked him, does he see a shift coming? Or is there anything we can do specifically that can expedite one in how the populace views our issues in the economy?
Good thing that I see going on is a lot of people, many, maybe millions by now, have been effectively seceding from the states where government is just too big and bloated and out of control. There's been a mass movement from New York and California and places like that to Texas, Florida, the Carolinas, states where the government is smaller and more restrained and there's more economic freedom. And that began during the whole COVID thing, but it's continuing now because of the economic situation. And that is encouraging. Every state is not like California as far as that goes, thank goodness. And so that's why, you move from California. If you're a person of means, you give yourself an immediate 13% pay raise because there's no state income tax in Florida, but there is in California. And I think that's one thing that Americans are doing and can continue to do. And I told a friend of mine recently that sort of means to me that the election for a local sheriff might be just as important or more important than the election for president, because the local authorities can affect your life in the big ways in a positive way by not enforcing the crazier federal mandates that come down the pike.
Right. And so do you see any cultural shift beyond the people moving to different states and people electing things locally? But do you think that there's going to be a shift? I know COVID kind of pushed it in that way, but will there be a shift in the mindset of the average citizen to see, like I talked about early on, saying you may not know it's called capitalism or economics, but that something's causing the bread to go up, or that paying people to sit home just doesn't really work out. So do you see a way, or do you see it shifting already because they've gone too far, but do you see a shift going culturally in the way the average people think about economics?
Yeah, well, I don't really think in terms of the averages, in terms of people. I know there are millions of people who understand these things now. They're the ones I'm talking about who are moving out of New York and California. And then there are some people who will never understand these things. And it's sort of a lost cause, which is why I think the only salvation is radical decentralization, secession, breaking up into maybe 10 or 15 different countries someday. That's how the people of the former Soviet Empire gained a great deal more freedom in their lives. It was peaceful. It could be very complicated, but I think democracy in a country of 330 million people is a farce. And so we need to start thinking of devolution of power away from Washington, D.C. in our daily lives.
And what is lastly, what would you like them to be the major takeaway from the book?
Major takeaway from the book is to be a good citizen, you need to be your own economist and educate yourself so that you are not bamboozled day in and day out, and so that your children and grandchildren are not bamboozled and lied to by people with a vested interest in talking on economic topics.
All right. He is Thomas J. DiLorenzo, a research fellow at the Independent Institute and author of the new book out today, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics. Tom, it's been great speaking with you. Thank you for your time.
You're very welcome, Charles. Have a great day.